Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm so excited about our presenter today, and I want to lay down a few preliminary remarks so that we can get to a process of learning with him. Before I forget, I'm holding up his newest book, Crossing Boundaries in the Americas, Vietnam, and the Middle East. It's his memoir, and he will be reading from it and signing books at Vroman's next Sunday afternoon at 4. So I hope that you all will attend. Before I give you a little more information about who he is, let me simply greet everyone, not only in this room, but also people who are streaming with us. We are thrilled and asking, wow, what's God doing in the fact that we have so many people streaming, live streaming our forums, sometimes from as many as 11 to 15 different countries, in addition to 25 states. So for those of you who are streaming with us, we welcome you. If any of you are not on my mailing list to get an email blast or announcement every Thursday about what's going to happen in this room and in church, there are green sign-up sheets on clipboards over at the action table, and all you have to do, thank you very much, is go there. You don't need to give us information if we already have you on the mailing list. Also over at that table is our action item for today. We are going through from Sunday to Sunday in terms of our actions the issues of our peace and justice agenda, which today at the action table includes getting sane gun violence prevention policies in this country. And today's action is for you to get educated about how you may unwittingly, through your retirement accounts or other instruments, be invested in gun companies that create and sell assault weapons and heavy clips for ammunition. So we want you to be aware of how you can divest from that, and also how All Saints is in the process of doing socially responsible investing here. Also, we would like to extend to any of you who are visiting with us, if you would like to participate in helping us finance this place, we would love to have your pledge, and you can get those at the red welcome table at the edge of the lawn. Now, another of our issues, which we'll be focusing on during Holy Week in terms of our action, is peace, nonviolence, the end to war and the war machinery, and also the Middle East. And we could not have someone who is more a walking witness of peacemaking than Ron Young. Back when he was a student at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, he participated in the student interracial ministry in Memphis as an assistant to our friend, the Reverend James Lawson. And he served as youth minister in a congregational church in Connecticut, and in March 1965, 50 years ago, he marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama. He is now the consultant for the National Interreligious Initiative for Peace, works with leaders of 25 U.S. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim national religious organizations to develop united advocacy positions and to mobilize public support for active, fair, and firm U.S. leadership for Arab, Israeli-Palestinian peace. He's written and spoken widely on the Middle East and interfaith cooperation. He's taught courses on the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, organized interfaith convocations for peace, generated statements and other resources endorsed by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim leaders. He was invited by the White House for the Israel-PLO Oslo Declaration in 1993. He's lectured at the Chautauqua Institution, speaking of peace in the Middle East and religion as a source of violence or peace. I am so very happy to have someone who can shine a light on the interlocking, intractable issues and problems of injustice and violence in the Middle East. Will you please warmly welcome Ron Young? Welcome.
I'm very, very glad to be here. Thanks to Rector Bacon. Just so you know, given the work I do, as I'm spending 10 days in the Los Angeles area, a couple of other things that I've done or will be doing this week is I spoke Friday night at Leo Baeck Temple, which this congregation has a long association with. I speak on Thursday to an interfaith group and on Friday morning before Jummah prayers at the Islamic Center of Southern California. And tomorrow I'm going to the University of California at Irvine, where relations between Jews and Muslims have not been all that hospitable. So I'm glad to be here. When Ed talked to me about what he wanted me to talk about, I thought he was going to leave it at the simple issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But he said, well, you know, there's this ISIS, and there are negotiations about Iran. I think you should talk about it all and make some sense of it together. At which point I said, I'll pay you the honorarium if you give that talk. But being foolish and appreciating how important what he said is about the collection of issues, I'm going to dare to speak about the three. ISIS first, Iran second, Israel-Palestine third, and you'll see in my tone and in what I say that I move from some degree of uncertainty and humility, my wife at this point would laugh, to a degree of more certainty and less humility when I get to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Santana, that wonderful quotation which we use but Americans still have not absorbed, that those who fail to remember history will repeat it, and I would add, and even make it worse the next time. And just briefly, I would say Vietnam and Iraq. So ISIS and extremism in the Middle East. There's an article back there, an op-ed article I wrote. I encourage you to read it. Those who came early can sleep now, while I briefly go through the points in that article. First of all, watch out for simplistic explanations of why there is extremism in the Middle East. Some will tend to say it's only indigenous problems, even maybe indigenous problems with Islam itself. Some will say it's not indigenous problems, it's all outside influences that are the cause of ISIS and extremism. I would say both those are simplistic and wrong in defining those as the causes. First, in terms of a couple of indigenous sources of Islam, of ISIS and extremism. The historic failure of Arab societies to develop democratic societies that allow popular participation and provide for broad-based economic development is a cause. The failure of Muslim leaders, Islamic leaders, and ordinary Muslims to resist strains of Islam which teach absolutism and hatred is another cause. Since Al-Qaeda and ISIS, more recently ISIS, Muslim leaders, both in the region and here in the West, are strongly resisting and speaking out against extremism based on Islamic teachings, and that's good. But as we know, there already has been terrible violence done in the name of Islam by tendencies which most Muslims, and having lived in the Middle East 3 years and traveled there very often, most Muslims, the vast majority of Muslims, consider to be malignant strains of their own tradition. And just to keep us honest, we have them in ours. And they aren't all dating back to the Crusades. They're alive today and poisoning the atmosphere in our country and the world. Now, as Americans, as we think about the extremism in the Middle East, it seems to me important, basically important, that we look at how possibly the United States has contributed either directly or indirectly to the rise of extremism. First point to remember is that in the decades after World War II, the United States showed almost no interest in encouraging democracy in Arab countries. The Cold War and access to oil were the guideposts, and the nature of the societies which helped us in the Cold War or provided us oil, it made little difference to us whether they were democracies or not, and mostly they were not. In Afghanistan, where we launched a war in response to 9/11 because al-Qaeda had found a base of support or at least tolerance in that country, we focus on that, but we failed to focus on the fact that during the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was involved in Afghanistan, we funded and trained Muslim fighters to resist the Russians. Those fighters later became fighters for al-Qaeda and now for ISIS. In Iraq, which we invaded because Iraq had nuclear weapons, in Iraq, we not only got rid of Saddam Hussein, but we got rid of the whole military and governmental structure which was dominated by the Sunnis. And in exchange, we wound up supporting the regime of Nouri al-Maliki, a Shiite regime which turned more exclusively Shiite in the months after it came to power, in fact, sending the president and vice president, the president and foreign minister, who were Sunnis, into exile, accusing them of being terrorists. Now, this happened with not so covert help from Iran. But so then we had a Shiite-dominated government, which in turn spawned a Sunni resistance, both by al-Qaeda and later by the formation of ISIS. In Syria, a country which Carol and I know reasonably well, having visited 11 times and having many friends there, and experiencing Syria experienced a just awful civil war, where initially a Arab Spring type popular revolt was brutally put down by the regime. There were efforts in 2011 and 2013 to resolve the civil war through negotiations and a diplomatic effort. Diplomatic efforts sponsored by the EU and led by two of the most seasoned, sensitive diplomats that the UN could offer. Kofi Annan, who had indeed been the General Secretary, and Ibrahim Lakhdar, an Algerian Muslim diplomat who is widely respected in circles that can't stand each other, because he seemed to be listening to the different parties and know that you had to include all of them if you were going to get any results that were positive. The US in that context, let me say parenthetically, because I want to focus on the US, there's plenty of blame to go around as to why those initiatives failed. Obviously, the Bashar Assad regime, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's complicated. But in terms of the US, three things made the US not fully support those diplomatic initiatives for a conference and a process toward the end of a civil war and a transition government. Number one, we played the Cold War game with Russia. Now, obviously, it takes two to tango, so Russia did it too. We played the Cold War game with Russia in the context of trying to find a solution in Syria. Second, we refused, the United States refused to accept that Iran needed to be in the negotiations and at the conference table, even though the US proclaimed, and was correct, that Iran was directly involved in the conflict. You can't do both. You can't say a country is involved in the conflict and try to have a conference to resolve the conflict and leave that country out. But that's what we did. We said, no, no Iran, no Iran, no Iran. And third, I think mistakenly, if understandably, given the experience with Egypt, our president declared that Bashar al-Assad must go. And he made it sound as if it was a precondition for negotiations. Well, if you're trying to get the regime of Bashar al-Assad to agree to come to negotiations, it's a bit problematic to say that the leader must go and make it sound as if it's a precondition. I think that was a mistake, and I say it was a mistake partly taught by a maybe more fortunate experience in Egypt, although that story is still being written. So those three examples of where US policy contributed directly and indirectly to the growth of ISIS. Third, The U.S. failure to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over decades and decades has contributed to the growth of extremism. It is foolish to say that that's the cause of extremism, and there are those who say, well, Israel's policies are the cause of extremism. It's foolish to say that Israel's policies are the cause of extremism. It's equally foolish to say that the failure to resolve that conflict has not made a contribution to fueling extremism. And I'll come back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, what does the U.S. do in regard to ISIS? First of all, military action. Ed said that I was tutored by Jim Lawson, and I'm glad he's not here because he might stand up and object when I say what I'm about to say. It's very difficult to say comfortably that the U.S. should take no military action against ISIS. It's very difficult to say it. But what I will say is that the history of military actions have tended to produce more bad results than good results. And it may well be the case for our bombing ISIS today. So it's a cautionary note. It's in a way, a leaf thrown in the wind because that decision is already made. That is to say, the decision to bomb is already made. It's not being debated. It hardly was debated. What's being debated, or was debated, still being debated, is should we do more? Should we put troops on the ground? And I think, frankly, there's probably enough caution, wisdom, and popular opposition to further involvement that that will not happen, that we won't put troops on the ground. But you know how these things go. One step, another step, an advisor is killed. I mean, do we remember Vietnam? So caution is my word about what's being done so far. But in the longer run, what the U.S. does politically and diplomatically will be more important and effective than what it does militarily. In Iraq, it is crucial the U.S. pressed the new government in Baghdad to be genuinely inclusive and work for policies that meet needs of all Iraqis, not Shiites only. That's a tough bill. But Iraqis themselves and even Iranian leaders seem to get that that may be something that needs to happen. In Afghanistan, as U.S. forces are withdrawn, economic and development aid to education and infrastructure will be more important, along with diplomatic help in reaching agreement with the Taliban and Pakistan than military aid. And I remember an incident when Kerry was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and I was asked by a rabbi what I thought about what we were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. And given who he was, even though our committee was not working on that issue, I thought I owed him a response. So I wrote a memo, and he said, that's really good. You should send that to Kerry. And I sent it to Kerry's aide on the Foreign Relations Committee. And I remember getting a call from him, and I didn't know him at all. He didn't know me. And he said, you know, it's a very interesting memo. And what I was suggesting was that rather than a surge, we stop any kind of direct military confrontation with the Taliban, and we only use military equipment like bulldozers with armored bulldozers to build schools. So it was a kind of, if you will, crazy-sounding pacifist idea. And Kerry's aide said, do you mind if I circulate this to other staff on the Foreign Relations Committee? Well, the thing that encouraged me about that was not particularly that it was my idea, but that there was openness to discussion of that kind of idea at that point in the Foreign Relations Committee, or at least among the staffers. Obviously, that's not what happened, and I wasn't surprised at that. But I was encouraged and surprised that there was this kind of openness, and that partly, of course, had to do with Kerry, who also had a Vietnam War experience, you remember, and came to a conclusion about the war that certainly one would not make if one wanted to be the next Secretary of State. But he became that, too, which is also a story about our country, which may be sick, but schizophrenia is a special kind of sickness. I mean, it means there are two Americas. Two Americas. Iran. Ed, you really are something.
I love it.
In particular, obviously, we're talking about the U.S. role in negotiations between the P5+1, that's the Security Council 5 with a veto, plus Germany, and Iran to reach an agreement on Iran's nuclear program to prevent, or more realistically, let's say, to reduce the chances of Iran developing nuclear weapons. Let's remember the context here. The context of the US, Russia, and other nuclear weapon states having gone ahead in developing greater stockpiles and more efficient nuclear weapons while declaring non-proliferation. We got them, you can't have them. That is such a stupid, bound-to-fail policy that one would have thought people would have laughed at the idea, except that we're suckered in on it. Sounds good. We've got them, they won't get them. Of course, they are getting them. In Pakistan, in India, in North Korea, in Israel, maybe now in Iran. So what's up? Remember our history in relations with Iran. Iranians don't forget. We forget, or we didn't know in the first place. 1953, the first elected Iranian government, Mossadegh is president, and our CIA is funded substantially to overthrow it, and does. And in comes the Shah, to whom we eagerly encourage and supply nuclear know-how to develop a nuclear program. Not nuclear weapons program. These were the Eisenhower years, remember, of atoms for peace, which I laugh at cautiously because the guy that started Earth Day is now for nuclear power development. So, you know, we've got to be careful that we don't think the truth we knew is the truth still. Though I suspect it may be. I'm saying I'm cautious about that. So I'm not making fun of the idea of nuclear power here. But I am saying that we supplied Iran with the encouragement and the knowledge and some of the technology to develop a nuclear program. So we need to remember that. And we need to remember that since 1979, since the revolution that overthrew our Shah, and Israel's Shah, by the way, since 1979, we've had no diplomatic relations with Iran. Our president has said that it's stupid to continue a policy of no relations with a country when for 50 years it seems to have had no salutary effect for the people of that country. Cuba. Same for Iran, same for Iran, same stupidity, same arrogance, same we can live in this world without having any relationship with you, which is foolishness. Foolishness. And we have secretly, and these days hardly anything is actually secret, we have supported efforts to overthrow the Iranian government. They know that. We tend to either ignore it or forget it or whatever. And then remember that Iran's last elected government, which this goes in sort of the other direction, if you will, Ahmadinejad, greatly increased fears and tensions in the region, certainly in Israel, and here, combined with Iranian support for Hezbollah and Hamas. And I want to stop here to say, there is, and my host Bob Berger and I were talking about this yesterday, there's no way that Iran is the source of terrorism of Hezbollah and Hamas. Hamas, Palestinians don't need Iran to feel like they want to do violence against Israel. Lebanese, who were occupied in southern Lebanon for 20 years, don't need Iran to be encouraged toward Hezbollah. Israel did that. But Iran is a supporter of those movements for its own geopolitical reasons. So it's a complicated situation in which genuine fears of Iran have to be taken into consideration. I come to Netanyahu, of course, who was reflecting genuine Israeli and Jewish and other people's fears, Saudi Arabia fears, about Iran, but did something encouraged by our own Republican Party here, or part of it, big part of it, to come and address the Congress and do something that the Daily News, I gather, called treason. Called treason. he didn't call the Netanyahu speech treason. Let me correct that. What he called treason was the letter from the 47 senators to the Iranian leaders, which basically said, you can't trust our president. He not only you can't trust him, but he doesn't have the power to make an agreement that will stick. Now, when you come to the negotiations, there are three, and this is, much too simplified with too little content, but I think not off the mark, basically. There are three things that people are concerned about. One is that Iran will break out, that is, have the technological capacity in a very short time to break out in having nuclear weapons. Second is sneak out, that because of things that we don't know are going on or cannot inspect or cannot be inspected by the International Inspection Agency, they will sneak out. They will be developing things secretly that we don't know about or can't see, and so that could lead to nuclear weapons. And the third concern in the negotiations is duration. How long will the agreement last? On those 3 points, in regard to the breakout, the negotiations are trying to achieve a limitation, a decrease in Iran's capacity. That is, reducing the number of centrifuges. They're not going to get rid of them, clearly, but reducing them, putting a cap on them, something like that. So limiting the technology, agreement to limit the technology. On sneak out, the agreement that's being sought is an agreement that would include intensive, intrusive inspection by the international agency. And third, on duration, they're talking about a time frame for the agreement of 10 to 15 years. No one that I have seen write or talk has suggested a shorter time period for controlling Iran's capacity to break out toward nuclear weapons. No one, including the Prime Minister of Israel. And this, by the way, was taken up by Israeli critics of the Prime Minister as well as by American critics. So what would happen if an agreement is passed? It would reduce the threat of Iran developing nuclear weapons by reducing capacity, by intensive inspection, and by a 10 to 15-year timeline, a duration. Second, what would be accomplished, it would open up some possibilities for cautious cooperation with Iran on other issues, on ISIS, in Iraq, in Syria, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was the Prime Minister before Ahmadinejad, Khatami, Prime Minister Khatami, who said publicly and wrote to Chairman Arafat, if you reach an agreement with Israel for a peace agreement, we will acknowledge and support it. This was the Iranian Prime Minister. So, the idea that there's one Iran with one face and one heart and one set of strategy, it's just, it's bull. It's bull. Iran is this, it's that. And, we live in a country, we should appreciate that. Right? I mean, we should appreciate it. Why do we think, that somehow other countries are one thing? Well, they're not. So even on Israeli-Palestinian, a breakthrough on the nuclear agreement, which would release some of the sanctions on Iran, could lead to new possibilities of cooperation if there's a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And then a third, which hasn't come up, and by the way, an Israeli journalist, whom I respect very much, a man named Akiva Eldar, suggested this in a column where he said this was Obama's secret weapon. Here's what he suggested. An agreement with Iran would open the door to seeking a nuclear-free Middle East. Remember, this is an Israeli saying that. Wow. What if Obama had said that? And in any case, his not having said it doesn't mean he couldn't say it at some point. And I would say not just a nuclear-free, but a nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. And obviously a step in that direction was taken in regard to Syria. It didn't help end the war, but it was a step in that direction when Syria agreed to give up and has apparently given up its chemical weapons, biological weapons. So that's the situation on Iran. I've wrapped that up. Now I'm going to come to the easy one, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
1, 2, 3.
Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's both. One of the simple things I say in speaking with people is if you take a map and talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, what does it look like on a map? It looks like a very small Israel surrounded by a lot of Arab countries. And by the way, it was called that if you look up bibliographical materials, until about 1982, that's what the conflict was called, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the picture, of course, is just what I said, all these Arab countries and small Israel. Now, the fact that Israel was the most powerful country and could defeat all those Arab countries is another fact that has to be considered. But looking at that map, you get a different psychological reaction than if you say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which then you have powerful Israel and the Palestinians. So, just how we say these things. And so I'm saying it's both. It's Arab-Israeli and Palestinian-Israeli. It's been going on for 6 decades, has involved at least 8 wars, and at least a half a dozen peace initiatives that have failed to resolve the core issue. The core issue being how Israelis and Palestinians, 2 very proud peoples who have suffered greatly, both with bone-deep claims to the legitimate same small land, how will they live together? There's the issue. I believe we know how they might live together more clearly and confidently than on some of these other issues. We know because we understand that each side's claim in this same small land are bone deep. If they weren't, they would have given them up by now, or they wouldn't have made them in the first place. They're bone deep. David Hartman, who is a rather well-known, I assume out here in LA too, among at least in some circles, a modern Orthodox Israeli rabbi who moved to Israel from Canada, in a conversation with a Palestinian one day, said to the Palestinian, the most important thing I want you to try to understand is that when we Jews come here to this land, we don't come as colonializers. We don't come as settlers. We've come home. And the Palestinian said, Rabbi, I am beginning to understand that. It's difficult for me, but I'm beginning to understand what you've just said. But all I want you to understand is when you come here, we were home. But you see, that rubs both ways. That rubs both ways. And one of the things that Carol and I learned in the 3 years we worked for American, British, and Canadian Quakers out there, with the Quaker-like assignment to listen to people, was that they're both right. They're both true. They both are reflecting the deepest sentiments and commitments and connections in their hearts and lives. And that's not an easy conflict to resolve. We know something about resolving the conflict because we've learned that there is no military solution to it. I mean, they fought how many wars? And it's still the same conflict. It's amazing how similar the lines of the conflict are after 8 wars. You'd think they would change some. And ironically, most of the wars really, quote, are won by the Israelis, but they're also lost by the Israelis. So we know something about resolving it because neither side could make the other disappear, even though each side wanted to do that. We know because the internationally accepted principles in UN Security Councils 242, 338, and Security Council Resolution 1397 have stood the test of time. So there are arguments now about them, but they are the basis for any negotiations that can work. We know because years of official and informal talks have produced principles and practical ideas for resolving the conflict. All of the issues, refugees, Jerusalem, all of them. There are now ideas out there that people know about. The ideas are widely known. Polls suggest at various times, depending on the mood at that time, that large numbers of Israelis and Palestinians would probably accept those agreements, but they don't have leaders on either side seemingly capable of delivering those agreements. We also know something about resolving the conflict, and this is where I'll end, by what Ambassador Daniel Kircher, the first Jewish ambassador to Egypt and to Israel, says was the dumbfoundedly lack of resolve with which the United States pursued its own initiatives. Kircher is saying that part of the problem, a major part of the problem, is the U.S. has not pursued its own peace initiatives with determination. I refer you now to the letter from the 33 Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religious leaders that's on the back table. Take that, look at it. And I want to end by this note. When I spoke at Leo Beck, before I spoke, I read Rabbi Chazin's Rosh Hashanah sermon. And I was struck by the fact that the rabbi made a point of talking with this man about how he was feeling after the Gaza war and about the sense of what do we do now? What can we do now? And the sense at that moment, last fall, that we couldn't make a big push for peace right now. And Ed, I think, worked inside himself to understand what Rabbi Chazin was saying and to say, you know, I understand what you're feeling now. And what I'm saying, what I said at Leo Beck the other night is, now is not last September, now is now. And what the U.S. must do is come out with a framework for peace that lays out the principles and ideas for resolving all the issues based on the former negotiations that Israelis and Palestinians have come up with, these ideas, lays them out, takes that to the Security Council, gets it endorsed, and presents it to the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority and say, okay, this is the basis for negotiating a final agreement. That's what I think the U.S. needs to do. And the reason I bring Ed and Ken Jason into this right now is that I hope that Ed and Ken will sit down and say, how do we make in this city a coalition of Jews and Christians and Muslims to support that kind of firm U.S. action to resolve this decades-old conflict? Thank you, thank you.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Do we still have any time?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
We have 10 more minutes.
Okay.
So, Ron, we have 10 more minutes. Some choir members will leave. That means they got to go. They're not angry or anything like that.
Okay. Wait a minute. He told me we were staying here till we resolved all the questions.
By 5 o'clock. So, we've got questions over here. 2 questions right here. Third question.
Go ahead. Okay.
Let's get these mics to you. Please give us a little minute to get the mic to you because we want everything to be heard on this. But these 3 hands are right here, and then we'll go beyond that. Go ahead, Bob.
So what time do you stop?
Thank you very much. If there's to be a 2-state solution to the conflict, what is the answer to the 600,000 Israelis now living in the West Bank?
Well, as I said, what's important about the ideas for solving this is that Israelis and Palestinians have come up with them. If I were to say that the RAND Corporation came up with them, I wouldn't know what significance that has. But Israelis and Palestinians have talked. And what they've talked about the question you raised, is that something like 70%, 80% of the Jewish settlers who live in the West Bank live near to the 67 line. And the area encompassed by those settlements would be incorporated into Israel in exchange on a one-for-one basis for lands in Israel today that would be turned over to the Palestinian state. That's the kind of solution. Now, that's rough. It's got to be detailed out, but that's what they've come up with, and I think it could work.
Second question, please.
I have a 2-part question that are related. On Monday or Tuesday, Israel has an election.
Yes.
And Netanyahu may be re-elected, or maybe may form a new government, form another government for 4 years, or Livni Herzog coalition may do so. How do you see the outcome of that election affecting some of the things that you've discussed? And the second part is, should President Obama and future presidents of this country continue to support almost blindly whatever needs Israel asks for?
Good. First question. The 3 options that are possible in the Israeli elections. One is that Netanyahu forces would win and he would form a government essentially by himself. The second, that Herzog's forces would win and he would form a government by himself. Right now, Herzog is ahead in the polling, but that is not conclusive. The third option is that one or the other of them would get to form the government, more likely Netanyahu, but because the election was so close, he would be forced to form a unity government that would include elements from Herzog's list, which would mean, for instance, the last election, Livni was the foreign secretary for Netanyahu. That may not give Livni much room, but it's a government with more possibility of resolving the conflict than one that has a hawk in that position. So that's, and that's how Israeli politics work. It's fascinating, it's sometimes frustrating, but so that's the options there. On supporting U.S. blindly supporting Israeli policy, I can tell you there are many Israelis who would say that has been the tragedy of American policy. Not that they would hope the U.S. would turn away from Israel, but that they would say the U.S. needs to support Israel's best interests, and that includes fundamentally finding a solution with the Palestinians. And I'll cite you an example. In the fall of 1982, when the Reagan Peace Initiative was up, and had encouraged Israelis and Palestinians to think there might be a way forward, Abba Eban and Shimon Peres urged the U.S. to cut economic aid to Israel as a pressure on the Begin government to stop settlements. That was, you can check it, look up Max Frankel, November 1982, New York Times columnist, in which he reported this. He reported it. He doesn't quote Abba Eban Shimon Peres by name. He says, unnamed sources, but I happen to know who the sources were. So here in 1982, Israelis are saying, help us by pressuring us to be our better self rather than our worser self. So stand with us, this slogan that's out there which John Hagee promotes. That's not the only way to stand with Israel. Stand with Israel today can mean stand with those Israelis who are desperately seeking a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and I hope we do. See Amos Oz's article in the LA Times or in the Jewish Journal. Amos Oz is now saying this is the last chance for a Jewish state. It's a powerful article. So we can stand with Israel, but what we should do is stand with the hope for Israel's future and the Palestinians' future.
Now, before I go to Lydia, let me ask a question here. So, Ron, correct my history if it's wrong, but let's just talk about Israeli and U.S. politics. My understanding is that during Daddy Bush's administration, there was some actual tough
yes.
resistance
yes.
to the development of the settlements.
Yes.
And so my question to you is, how do we get from there to all of the cranes are in the air everywhere building more settlements?
Well, it's an interesting example. It's true. In the run-up to the Madrid Peace Conference, after the first Gulf War, Bush and Baker said to Shamir, Prime Minister Shamir, you've got to stop the settlements. And if you don't, we're not going to give loan guarantees to help you settle Soviet Jews who were coming in, Russian Jews who were coming into Israel. But you know what happened then? AIPAC organized a lobby day in Washington saying, give the aid without conditions. Bush went on television in a press conference and said, I hear there are 1,000 lobbyists. He didn't say Jews, but everybody knew what he meant. There are 1,000 Jewish lobbyists, I'll insert the word, down here yesterday saying give aid without conditions, and I'm only one lonely little guy holding up our end. Well, you know what that image is? That's the image of the Jews control the country. And I can tell you and name them, hundreds of Reform rabbis and other rabbis who were for what Bush was doing. When that happened, they shut up because they were scared and because their community was scared. So it was an example where we do something tough, but we do it without any sensitivity. And it's funny that it came out of Texas, you know? It's interesting that it came out of Texas. So what needs to happen is it needs to be tough. I'll tell you one more story that is very important on this point. Rabbi David Saperstein, who was the head of the Religious Action Center in Washington and a political pro, and is now the Obama's ambassador for religious liberty around the world. We were meeting with the Assistant Secretary of State. And David said to him, stay a minute more, I have something to say. And so the person sat down. And David said, you know, he said, the Reform movement has been on record for decades against expansion of settlements. And that's true. You can check it out. Reform Jewish movement, decades against expansion of settlements. He said, never has any administration come to us and said, we need your help in getting them stopped. Never. Never. So what we need to do is create an atmosphere where we say to Obama, we want you to be ready, and if you're ready, we're ready to help you.
Last question, Lydia.
The speech by Netanyahu at our Congress was not met very well in Israel. And you went right quickly over Herzog being ahead in the polls. Wouldn't it be, what do you think about Herzog winning the election, putting together a coalition for parliament, and wouldn't that get the framework and I mean, we seem like we're stuck.
Yep. It'd be much better for the chances of for peace if Herzog wins. It's doubtful because somebody in power and a person whose main goal in life is to stay in power, that's Netanyahu, that he'll do anything to stay in power. So I think Herzog winning is a small chance. But, sorry, just repeat the beginning of your sentence because it was something very important.
Well, that Netanyahu coming to Congress was not very popular in Israel.
Well, okay. He bounced 2 percentage points. The Likud bounced up 2 percentage points after the speech, but then lost the percentage points within a few days. So this or that. It didn't seem to have much effect. But Herzog winning, you know, it's doubtful. Unity government coming into power with Netanyahu as the head, maybe. And all I am saying, and what the religious leaders, the U.S. religious leaders are saying, whatever happens in the Israeli elections, whatever happens in terms of important Palestinian efforts to form a unity government of Hamas and Fatah, whatever happens in that, we should announce a framework for peace that we present to those governments and say, here it is, not here's the agreement, but here's the framework. Are you ready to negotiate and let the chips fall where they may?
Thank you very, 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 very much. George Regas wants to say hi. See George in the back.
Jesus. Well, wait a minute. Listen, Mr. Rector Regas is here. God bless you. And he told me that he always sits in the back and mostly listens, but sometimes falls asleep.
And he has grown, his opinions have broadened, and I have learned a lot, and I respect our companionship, Ron, so keep on keeping on.
One of my most memorable trips to the region was a trip where George and Leonard participated in the trip together, and there was an incident which I will not describe now, but of the two not understanding each other, which Joan Behrman said to me the other day, may have been the only time in 50 years that George and Leonard disagreed. Thank you. Thank you for all.